Imagine it's 1938. The world is on the brink of chaos. Millions of lives are about to be changed forever. But what if I told you that the entire world, right at this moment, is unknowingly preparing for the most devastating war in human history? Hey everyone! Welcome back to the channel. Today, we're going to dive deep into a moment in history that changed everything. 1938. The year before World War II began, but the world was already unknowingly preparing for it. Now, we've all heard about the horrors of the war that followed. But what was happening just before it all started? What were the world leaders thinking? And why was 1938 a year of both dread and hope? Let's go back in time and discover what really went down as the biggest war the world has ever seen began to take shape. The year is 1938. The world, still recovering from the horrors of the First World War, believes it has found a path to peace. But what people don't know is that a much darker storm is already forming in the heart of Europe. This is a time of great change and uncertainty, and no one is ready for the storm that's about to hit. A world in recovery. After the end of World War I in 1918, the world tried to heal its wounds. The war had destroyed millions of lives, left countries in ruins, and caused the collapse of empires. Europe, especially, was left scarred, both physically and emotionally. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, was meant to bring peace and prevent future conflicts. It placed harsh conditions on Germany, the nation that was seen as the main cause of the war. But this treaty didn't bring the lasting peace it promised. Germany was humiliated and broken by the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. The country was forced to pay enormous reparations to other nations, and its military was severely limited. The German economy was in shambles, and many people lived in poverty. The country was in a state of constant political and economic turmoil. But in the midst of all this suffering, a new leader was rising to power. The rise of Adolf Hitler, a soldier who had fought in World War I, began to rise to prominence in the 1920s. He joined the National Socialist German Workers' Party, better known as the Nazi Party, and quickly became its leader. Hitler promised to restore Germany to its former glory, to overturn the Treaty of Versailles, and to bring an end to the country's suffering. Hitler's powerful speeches and ability to connect with the frustrations of ordinary Germans made him a popular figure. By 1933, he had become the Chancellor of Germany, and soon after he consolidated his power to become a dictator. Under his rule, the Nazi Party began to implement extreme nationalist and racist policies, aiming to rebuild Germany and create a pure Aryan state. But while Hitler was rising to power, most of the world was either unaware of or unwilling to confront the danger that he posed. They were still living with the scars of World War I and hoped that peace would last. Many believed that the harshness of the Treaty of Versailles had gone too far, and some even thought that Hitler's aggressive rhetoric was just that, empty words. But this was far from the truth. Hitler's goals were far more dangerous than anyone could imagine. The League of Nations and false hope for peace. In the aftermath of World War I, the League of Nations was established as a global organization to help prevent future wars. The League's main goal was to promote peace and cooperation between nations. However, the League's ability to prevent war was weak from the start. The United States, despite its involvement in the First World War, did not join the League, weakening its authority. As the 1930s rolled on, the League of Nations failed to address several key global issues, including the rise of fascism in Italy and Germany. While Hitler's Nazi regime began rearming Germany in defiance of the Treaty of Versailles, the League of Nations did little to stop him. The world was still recovering from the last war and was reluctant to confront the rising threat. A false sense of security in 1938, many people still believed that peace could be maintained. After all, the Great Depression of the 1930s had caused widespread hardship around the world, and the idea of another global conflict seemed unimaginable. Many leaders were focused on economic recovery, and the memories of the First World War were still fresh in their minds. Most thought that no one would dare start another war so soon. However, Hitler was not only rebuilding Germany's military power, He was also challenging the very idea of peace. He began to openly defy the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. He sent German troops into the Rhineland, a region that had been demilitarized as part of the treaty. But instead of being stopped, Hitler was allowed to continue, and the world did nothing. This act of aggression should have been a wake-up call, but many refused to believe that Hitler was actually preparing for war. Appeasement, the world's misguided hope. As Hitler's power grew, the major European powers, particularly Britain and France, began to focus on diplomacy and appeasement. The idea behind appeasement was simple. If the Allies gave Hitler some of what he wanted, it might keep the peace. After all, they had just gone through a devastating war, and no one wanted to fight again. The hope was that by satisfying some of Hitler's demands, the Nazis would be satisfied and peace would be preserved. One of the most notable moments of appeasement came in 1938 with the Munich Agreement. This agreement allowed Hitler to annex the Sudetenland, a region in Czechoslovakia that was home to a large German-speaking population. The leaders of Britain and France, Neville Chamberlain and Édouard Daladier, along with Adolf Hitler, signed the Munich Agreement. Hitler had promised that this would be his last territorial demand in Europe. Chamberlain returned to Britain after signing the agreement, waving a piece of paper in the air, claiming that he had secured peace for our time. Many people in Britain and France believed that this was the best solution to avoid war, but they were wrong. By giving in to Hitler's demands, the Western powers had not stopped him. They had emboldened him. Hitler's ambitions were far greater than just taking the Sudetenland. The dangers of appeasement. The Munich Agreement was a dangerous gamble. While it was meant to avoid war, it actually made war more likely. Hitler was never interested in peace. He wanted total domination of Europe. The appeasement strategy was based on the false belief that Hitler's ambitions were limited, and that all he wanted was to restore Germany to its former glory. But in reality, Hitler had grand plans to create a vast Nazi empire across Europe, and the Sudetenland was just one small piece of that plan. As the year progressed, people in Europe began to realize the true danger of Hitler's regime. But by then, it was too late to stop the wheels of war from turning. The major powers had missed their chance to act, and now they would have to face the consequences. A world on edge in 1938. While Europe seemed to be enjoying a false sense of peace, tension was building under the surface. The Nazi regime was openly rearming, and Hitler's expansionist ambitions were becoming clearer every day. In Italy, Mussolini's fascist regime was growing in power, and Japan was also expanding its empire in Asia. Around the world, governments were preparing for the worst, but they were too slow to act. Meanwhile, people across Europe were living in fear. They saw the growing power of Nazi Germany, and many wondered if war was inevitable. But how could they have known? Hitler was a master manipulator, using propaganda and fear to sway the people and leaders around him. It was only after the Munich Agreement that the world began to understand just how dangerous he really was. Conclusion. The calm before the storm. A world in 1938 was like a ship sailing into a storm without realizing it. Nations were focused on recovering from the First World War, and many believed peace was possible. But behind the scenes, Adolf Hitler was preparing for something far more catastrophic. The policy of appeasement, which many thought would preserve peace, only gave Hitler the confidence to push further and further. By the time the world realized the danger, it was already too late. World War II was on the horizon, and the events of 1938 were the calm before the storm. This was the moment when history could have gone in a different direction. But the world's leaders chose to wait, and in doing so, they sealed the fate of millions. What could have been done differently? Was there a way to stop Hitler before it was too late? These are the questions that we'll explore as we continue to dive into the story of 1938 and the road to the greatest war the world had ever seen. In the year 1938, Europe stood at a dangerous crossroads. While the world was still recovering from the horrors of the First World War, a new threat was rising. That threat came from Nazi Germany, and more specifically from its leader Adolf Hitler. The world had already started to see signs of the Nazi regime's aggressive expansion. But the Sudetenland Crisis would be one of the most significant turning points in history. This was the moment when the world's leaders made a fateful decision that would shape the future of Europe and the world itself. The Sudetenland, a region of tension. The Sudetenland was a region in Czechoslovakia that bordered Germany. It had a significant German-speaking population, which made it a central point of tension between the Czechoslovakian government and Nazi Germany. Adolf Hitler, who was building his power and influence in Europe, wanted to unite all ethnic Germans under one nation. This idea, known as pan-Germanism, was a key part of Nazi ideology. In 1938, Hitler began to demand that Czechoslovakia hand over the Sudetenland to Germany. He argued that the German-speaking people living there were being oppressed and that it was their right to be part of Germany. Of course, this was just an excuse. Hitler's real goal was to expand German territory and strengthen his control over Europe. The Czechoslovakian response. The government of Czechoslovakia was deeply concerned about Hitler's demands. The Sudetenland was a strategically important region, rich in natural resources and home to much of the country's defense infrastructure. The Czechoslovakian army was stationed in the Sudetenland to protect it from potential invasion, and losing this region would leave the country vulnerable to Nazi aggression. The Czechoslovakian leaders knew that they couldn't fight Germany alone. They had alliances with France and the Soviet Union, but both of these countries were reluctant to go to war over the Sudetenland. The world had already seen how devastating World War I had been, and many believed that war could be avoided if they made some compromises. Appeasement in action. The Munich Agreement. At this critical moment, Britain and France, led by Neville Chamberlain and Edouard Daladier, stepped in. Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, was especially eager to avoid war. In his view, the best way to keep the peace was to give Hitler some of what he wanted, hoping that this would satisfy his territorial ambitions. In September 1938, a series of high-level meetings were held between Britain, France, Italy, and Germany. The goal was to reach a diplomatic solution to the Sudetenland crisis without resorting to war. Mussolini, the fascist leader of Italy, played the role of mediator, and Hitler was keen to pressure the other leaders into agreeing to his demands. The result of these talks was the Munich Agreement. This agreement allowed Nazi Germany to annex the Sudetenland in exchange for a promise from Hitler that he would make no further territorial demands in Europe. The leaders of Britain, France, and Italy believed that this was the only way to avoid war, and they convinced Czechoslovakia to accept the deal, even though the Czechoslovakian government was not involved in the negotiations. When Chamberlain returned to Britain after signing the agreement, he famously declared that he had secured peace for our time. The British public, weary from the memories of World War I, were relieved. It seemed like war had been avoided, at least for the time being. But this moment, hailed as a diplomatic victory by some, would soon prove to be a huge mistake. The real cost of appeasement. The Munich Agreement was a classic example of the policy of appeasement. Appeasement meant giving in to some of Hitler's demands in the hope that this would satisfy him and prevent a larger conflict. But the policy of appeasement was based on a dangerous miscalculation: the belief that Hitler could be trusted and that his ambitions were limited. In reality, Hitler was not interested in peace. He was only interested in expanding his power and creating a greater Germany. The Sudetenland was just one part of his larger plan. By allowing him to take control of the region, the Western powers had not stopped him. They had only emboldened him. Hitler now knew that he could push further and that the other nations were unwilling to stop him. What made the Munich Agreement even worse was the fact that the leaders of Britain, France, and Italy were so eager to avoid war that they completely ignored the long-term consequences of their actions. By sacrificing Czechoslovakia, they had set a dangerous precedent. They had allowed an aggressive dictatorship to expand its power without facing any real opposition. The Munich Agreement did not bring peace. It merely delayed the inevitable. The aftermath of the Munich Agreement. In the months following the Munich Agreement, Hitler's ambitions continued to grow. In March 1939, just 6 months after the signing of the agreement, Hitler invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia, breaking his promise and proving that appeasement had failed. The world was now faced with the reality that Hitler could not be trusted, and that he was determined to expand Nazi control across Europe. But by the time Hitler moved on to the rest of Czechoslovakia, the damage had already been done. The Munich Agreement had convinced Hitler that he could continue his territorial expansion with little resistance. Britain and France, realizing their mistake, began to prepare for the possibility of war, but it was now too late to stop the momentum that Hitler had built. A dangerous precedent. The Munich Agreement is often cited as one of the most significant mistakes in modern history. By giving in to Hitler's demands, Britain, France, and Italy not only betrayed Czechoslovakia, but they also sent a dangerous message to the world: that appeasement would work, and that aggressors could get away with expanding their territories without facing consequences. This mistake allowed Hitler to grow stronger, and it ultimately led to the outbreak of World War II. The Sudetenland Crisis, which could have been a turning point in history, became a symbol of the world's failure to recognize the true threat posed by Nazi Germany. It showed the dangers of underestimating a dictator and the consequences of failing to take action when it mattered most. The Sudetenland Crisis and the path to war. The Sudetenland Crisis was a turning point in the road to war. It revealed the growing power of Hitler and the failure of appeasement. But it also revealed the deep divisions within Europe. The world was not ready for the kind of war that was coming, and many leaders believed that war could be avoided through diplomacy. But diplomacy alone could not stop a man like Hitler. The Munich Agreement may have delayed war for a time, but it also marked the beginning of the end. By giving in to Hitler, the world had shown that dictators could achieve their goals without facing real consequences. The Sudetenland Crisis was just one chapter in the story of how the world was pushed toward a devastating conflict that would engulf the entire globe. Conclusion. The Sudetenland Crisis was more than just a territorial dispute. It was a warning. It showed the dangers of appeasement and the failure of diplomacy in the face of an aggressive dictator. As the world continued to ignore the growing threat of Nazi Germany, the path to World War II became clearer. What if the world had stood up to Hitler in 1938? What if they had taken a stronger stance against his demands? Could the war have been avoided? These are the questions that continue to haunt historians and the descendants of those who lived through those dark times. The Sudetenland Crisis was a pivotal moment in history. It was the moment when the world should have realized the true danger of Nazi Germany. But instead, they chose to give in, and in doing so, they sealed the fate of millions. After the Munich Agreement of 1938, many believed that peace had been secured. Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, even declared that Britain had secured peace for our time. But little did they know, the worst was yet to come. Despite the promises made in the Munich Agreement, Hitler's ambitions continued to grow, and the tension across Europe began to rise. This was a time when the world could still have stopped the chaos, but the window for peace was quickly closing. Hitler's next moves. The false promises. The Munich Agreement had allowed Nazi Germany to annex the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia, a strategic and resource-rich part of the country. Hitler had promised that this would be the last territorial demand he made. But just months after the agreement, Hitler showed the world that his promises meant nothing. In March 1939, barely 6 months after the Munich Agreement, Hitler broke his word. He invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia, taking over the entire country. This was the moment when the world realized that appeasement had failed, and the danger posed by Nazi Germany was real. Hitler's true intentions were becoming clear. He was not satisfied with just the Sudetenland. He wanted to expand his control over all of Europe. The world's reaction. Alarm bells ringing. When Hitler marched into Czechoslovakia, the world was finally forced to wake up. This was not the action of a man seeking peace. It was the action of a dictator bent on domination. Yet even after this blatant act of aggression, many countries still hesitated to take immediate action against Hitler. Britain and France, still shaken by the memories of World War I, were not eager to enter another war. But this time, They could no longer ignore the threat. In Britain, there was growing concern among the public and political leaders that Hitler's actions were a direct threat to the security of all of Europe. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, who had previously championed appeasement, began to shift his stance. He knew that Germany could not be allowed to keep expanding unchecked, but there was still reluctance to take military action. Meanwhile, Adolf Hitler was not slowing down. He was convinced that the world would never stop him. His confidence was growing, and he began making even more daring moves. But the question was, what would the world do next? Would they confront Hitler now, or would they continue to delay until it was too late? The danger of underestimating Hitler's ambitions. Throughout 1939, Hitler's actions made one thing clear. He was preparing for war. He began to openly rearm Germany, building a powerful military force in direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles. He had already taken Austria in 1938 and had claimed the Sudetenland. Now, with the invasion of Czechoslovakia, Hitler was moving closer to his larger goal: the domination of all of Europe. What was even more worrying was that Hitler's ambitions were not just limited to Europe. His views were shaped by extreme nationalist and racial ideas. He wanted to create an Aryan superstate and believed that Germany needed more space to expand and grow. This idea was known as Lebensraum, or living space. Hitler believed that the German people had the right to expand eastward into Poland and Russia. And to do that, he needed to neutralize any potential resistance. The leaders of Britain, France, and other nations could see that Hitler wasn't just interested in taking back lost territories. He was planning for global domination. However, many of them still refused to acknowledge the full scale of the threat. The alliance between Germany and Italy, the Rome-Berlin axis. While the Western powers hesitated, Hitler began to strengthen his position by forming alliances with other fascist regimes. One of the most important alliances was with Italy, led by Benito Mussolini. In 1939, Hitler and Mussolini formed the Rome-Berlin axis, a military and political alliance that would become one of the driving forces of World War II. This alliance between Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy was a key step in the growing power of the Axis powers. Together, Germany and Italy sought to reshape Europe and the world. This partnership gave Hitler even more confidence, knowing that he had a powerful ally in his quest for expansion. But the formation of the Rome-Berlin axis also made things more complicated for the rest of the world. Britain and France were now facing a united front of dictatorships in Germany and Italy. They could no longer afford to ignore the rising threat. The tension in Europe increases. As 1939 progressed, the atmosphere in Europe became increasingly tense. Everywhere you looked, nations were either preparing for war or trying to avoid it. Poland became especially concerned, as they were the next target on Hitler's list. Hitler had already made it clear that he wanted to expand eastward, and Poland stood directly in his path. In response to the growing danger, Britain and France made an important decision. In March 1939, just days after Hitler invaded Czechoslovakia, Britain and France both promised Poland that they would come to its defense if Germany attacked. This was a significant shift in policy. Up until this point, Britain and France had been trying to avoid war, but now they were publicly committing to stand against Nazi aggression. Despite these promises, Poland was still unsure of the sincerity of Britain and France's commitment. Poland was surrounded by powerful neighbors, with Nazi Germany to the west and the Soviet Union to the east. If Germany invaded, Poland would be caught between two powerful forces. But even as Poland prepared for the worst, no one knew for sure how the world would respond to Hitler's next move. Hitler's bold move. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. In the midst of all this tension, Hitler made a shocking move. He entered into an alliance with Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union. This was a surprising turn of events, because Germany and the Soviet Union had been bitter enemies for years. But in August 1939, Hitler and Stalin signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression pact that promised that neither country would attack the other. This agreement between Germany and the Soviet Union meant that Hitler no longer had to worry about a two-front war. He could now focus all of his military efforts on Poland without worrying about the Soviet Union attacking from the east. The signing of this pact sealed Poland's fate. Hitler was now free to invade without fear of Soviet interference. The final countdown: war is imminent. With the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in place, the situation became even more critical. The world had entered a countdown to war. Hitler was now in a position to invade Poland, and Britain and France had pledged to defend Poland. There was no turning back now. The tension in Europe had reached its peak. The question was no longer if war would come, but when. On September 1, 1939, Hitler invaded Poland, marking the official beginning of World War II. Britain and France, true to their word, declared war on Germany just days later, and the world was plunged into the greatest conflict it had ever known. Conclusion: rising tension in Europe in 1939 was the final stage before the outbreak of World War II. Hitler's actions, his invasion of Czechoslovakia, his alliance with Italy, and his shocking pact with Stalin made it clear that he was not interested in peace. He was determined to expand Germany's borders and control all of Europe. The world had one last chance to stop him, but the hesitations of the Western powers, combined with Hitler's ruthless ambition, made conflict inevitable. When Hitler invaded Poland, the world finally realized that there was no avoiding war. The tension that had been building for years had finally reached a boiling point, and the Second World War had begun. As 1939 unfolded and the world began to feel the weight of the escalating situation in Europe, one thing became clear: the world was watching in silence. Despite the obvious signs of danger, most nations hesitated to take meaningful action against Adolf Hitler and the growing power of Nazi Germany. Hitler's rise and his increasingly aggressive moves across Europe were like a ticking time bomb, but the world still didn't act decisively until it was too late. The question remains: why did the world wait so long to respond? The start of the invasion. A global wake-up call on September 1, 1939, Hitler crossed the line that no one could ignore. He invaded Poland with a brutal blitzkrieg, lightning war attack. The German forces quickly overwhelmed Poland's defenses, striking with overwhelming speed and force. This invasion was not only an attack on Poland but also a direct violation of international law, and it made it clear that Hitler had no intention of stopping his expansion. However, even after this brazen act of aggression, many nations still hesitated to respond. Britain and France, who had already promised to defend Poland, declared war on Germany just 2 days later on September 3, 1939. But for the most part, the rest of the world did not take immediate action. The world was still trying to come to terms with the idea of another global war. Despite the clear threat of Nazi expansion, many countries were uncertain about how to respond. The policy of appeasement falls apart. The policy of appeasement, which had been so strongly embraced by Britain and France in the previous years, had now reached its breaking point. The leaders of these nations had hoped that they could avoid war by making concessions to Hitler, giving him what he wanted in the hopes that he would stop pushing for more. But this strategy had failed miserably. The Munich Agreement, signed just a year earlier, was a glaring example of this appeasement policy. The leaders of Britain, France, and Italy had allowed Hitler to take over the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia in exchange for his promise that he would make no more territorial demands. Yet Hitler had violated this promise, taking all of Czechoslovakia and then moving on to invade Poland. After the invasion of Poland, it was clear that appeasement had only encouraged Hitler to become more aggressive. However, the reality of war was still a terrifying thought for many people. The world had already been through one devastating world war, and the memories of the destruction and loss of life were still fresh. The public was afraid that another war would lead to even more death and suffering. The silence of the neutral nations. While Britain and France declared war, many other countries, especially the neutral nations in Europe, chose to stay silent. They watched as Germany expanded, unsure of how to respond. Italy, led by Benito Mussolini, and Japan, which was already engaged in its own expansion in China, were also involved in military activities. but they were not yet directly involved in the war. The silence from these nations only made the situation worse, as it allowed Hitler to continue his campaign of conquest with little to no opposition. The United States, meanwhile, was deeply committed to isolationism. Despite the growing threat in Europe, the U.S. was unwilling to become involved in another foreign conflict. The memories of the First World War and the devastating losses it had caused still weighed heavily on the American public. As a result, the U.S. stayed out of the war for as long as possible, offering moral support to Britain and France, but not engaging in direct military action. This silence from the major powers, along with the lack of coordinated international action, allowed Hitler to continue pushing forward, making the situation even more dangerous. His ambitions had already expanded well beyond Germany's borders, and now he was taking on a global stage, the rise of Nazi propaganda and control. While the rest of the world hesitated, Nazi Germany continued to build its war machine, using propaganda to manipulate both its own people and the world at large. Hitler's regime controlled almost every aspect of German life, from the media to education, using propaganda to spread the idea of German superiority and the Aryan race. The Nazis presented themselves as saviors of Germany, claiming that they were simply reclaiming lost territory and securing a future for the German people. The German people, many of whom were still recovering from the economic disaster caused by the Great Depression, were swept up in this narrative. Hitler's promises of a better future and the restoration of Germany's greatness resonated with many people. As a result, there was widespread support for his policies, at least in the early years of his rule. But this was not just a war of military conquest. It was also a war of ideology. Hitler's ideas of racial purity and nationalism were central to the Nazi regime. He believed that Germans had a right to rule over other peoples, particularly those in Eastern Europe. This ideology was used to justify the invasion of Poland and later, the invasion of other countries across Europe. The world watches as civilians suffer as the war began in earnest. Millions of civilians in occupied territories began to suffer. In Poland, the invasion was brutal. The German army not only attacked military targets, but also systematically destroyed entire cities and villages. Non-German civilians, especially Jews, were subjected to violence, forced labor, and even mass executions. This brutality was only a glimpse of what was to come. Hitler's goal was not only to conquer territory, but to wipe out entire populations that he considered undesirable. The Holocaust, the systematic genocide of 6 million Jews, would unfold over the next few years, but the early stages of persecution had already begun in Poland. The world, however, watched in silence. The international community, still recovering from the trauma of the First World War, was slow to respond to these atrocities. Many countries were unwilling to act, either because they didn't fully understand the extent of the violence, or because they feared the consequences of getting involved in another war. A delayed response. The call to action. As the war continued to escalate, the silence of the world began to weigh heavily on those who were living under Nazi occupation. People in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and other countries that had been taken over by Nazi forces were suffering immensely. Resistance movements began to form in many countries, but they were small and poorly equipped. The brutal tactics used by the Nazis made it difficult for any real resistance to take hold. The leaders of Britain and France, despite their declarations of war, found themselves limited in their ability to act quickly. The response was slow, and many of the countries that had once stood together in the face of the First World War were now divided. As the situation worsened, people in countries outside of Europe, especially in the United States, began to wake up to the reality of the situation. But for the people living under Nazi control, the silence of the world meant that they were left to face the horrors alone for far too long. The end of silence. The world's silence could not last forever. As Nazi Germany continued to invade and conquer countries, the international community was finally forced to act. The United States eventually entered the war after the bombing of Pearl Harbor by Japan in December 1941. This attack drew the U.S. into the conflict, and the combination of American industrial power and military strength would turn the tide of the war. By then, the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, had expanded their control over much of Europe and parts of Asia. The world was now fully engaged in the fight, but the damage had already been done. The Nazis had already carried out their brutal campaigns of conquest and genocide, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. Conclusion. The price of silence. The world's silence in the face of Hitler's aggression allowed the Nazis to grow stronger and more dangerous. The failure to act quickly against Hitler's early moves in Europe had serious consequences. Millions of lives were lost, and the world would never be the same again. As the war raged on, the world finally woke up to the full extent of the evil that had been allowed to spread unchecked. But by then, it was too late to prevent the devastation that was already unfolding. The lessons of World War II are clear. When faced with the rise of aggression and hate, the world cannot afford to stay silent. The cost of inaction is far too great. As 1939 moved forward, the world began to understand the terrible consequences of appeasement. For years, leaders of Britain and France, particularly Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, had followed a policy of appeasing Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany. They believed that if they gave Hitler some of what he wanted, land and power, he would be satisfied and the world could avoid another war. But this policy of appeasement ultimately failed. Instead of bringing peace, it only emboldened Hitler, allowed Nazi Germany to grow stronger, and set the stage for World War II. Let's look at why appeasement was so dangerous and how it led the world closer to war. The promise of peace. The Munich Agreement. The idea behind appeasement was simple. The leaders of Britain and France wanted to avoid another devastating world war. They knew how much destruction World War I had caused, and they didn't want to face the same horrors again. When Hitler began to demand more territory, they hoped that by giving in to his demands, they could prevent conflict and keep the peace. In 1938, one of the clearest examples of appeasement was the Munich Agreement. At the time, Hitler demanded the Sudetenland, a region in Czechoslovakia with a large German-speaking population. He argued that the people living there were being oppressed and that they should be allowed to join Germany. Although this wasn't true, Hitler used the situation as an excuse to expand his power. Rather than standing firm against Hitler, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and French Prime Minister Édouard Daladier met with Hitler in Munich, Germany to negotiate. The leaders of Italy and Germany were also present. At this meeting, the decision was made to allow Hitler to take the Sudetenland without a fight. In exchange, Hitler promised that this would be the last territorial demand he would make. Chamberlain returned to Britain after the Munich Agreement and famously waved a piece of paper, declaring that he had secured peace for our time. Many people in Britain were relieved, believing that they had avoided another war. But this moment, hailed as a diplomatic victory by some, would soon prove to be one of the biggest mistakes in modern history. Why did appeasement fail? The idea of appeasement seemed reasonable at the time. After all, no one wanted to repeat the horrors of the First World War, and many believed that Hitler was just trying to restore Germany's power, which had been weakened after the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. However, there were several key reasons why appeasement failed so badly. Underestimating Hitler's ambitions. The biggest mistake of appeasement was the belief that Hitler could be satisfied. The leaders of Britain and France thought that once Hitler regained some lost territories, he would stop demanding more. They failed to recognize that Hitler's ambitions went far beyond just restoring Germany to its pre-World War I borders. Hitler wanted to create a greater Germany, and he believed that Germany's survival depended on expanding eastward into Poland and Russia. He was also driven by extreme nationalist and racist ideas, believing that the Aryan race was superior and that other races, particularly Jews, were inferior. This kind of thinking made him desire more land, power, and control, not peace. Encouraging further aggression. Instead of stopping Hitler, the Munich Agreement actually encouraged him to be more aggressive. Hitler saw that Britain and France were willing to make huge concessions just to avoid war, and he realized that they were unlikely to fight back if he pushed further. By allowing Hitler to take the Sudetenland, the Western powers showed him that they would not stand in his way. So what did Hitler do next? He broke his promise and took over the rest of Czechoslovakia in March 1939, just months after the Munich Agreement. At this point, the world should have recognized that appeasement was a failed strategy. Hitler's actions showed that he could not be trusted, and that he was determined to expand Nazi Germany no matter what. Misreading the situation, the leaders of Britain and France also misjudged the mood of the German people and the scale of the threat. While it's true that many Germans were unhappy with the harsh terms of the Treaty of Versailles, this did not mean that they supported Hitler's aggression. Many Germans were initially attracted to his promises of restoring national pride and rebuilding the economy, but they were not necessarily interested in war. The Western leaders should have realized that appeasing Hitler only made the situation worse, as it allowed him to strengthen Germany's military and influence without facing any real opposition. Ignoring the value of alliances, Czechoslovakia, the country that was most directly affected by the Munich Agreement, was left defenseless. The Czechoslovakian government had alliances with France and the Soviet Union, but when it came time for those allies to act, they did nothing to protect Czechoslovakia's sovereignty. This failure to support Czechoslovakia showed how fragile international alliances were at the time. Instead of standing together against Nazi Germany, the Western powers betrayed Czechoslovakia, sending the wrong message to Hitler that the international community would not intervene if he took what he wanted. The moment appeasement failed, the real turning point came after Hitler's invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1939. This was a direct violation of the Munich Agreement, and it shattered any illusions that Hitler could be satisfied with small gains. The world had been given a second chance to stop Hitler, but instead of acting, Britain and France continued to hesitate. The policy of appeasement had not only failed, it had backfired, giving Hitler the confidence to push forward with his territorial ambitions. At this point, Britain and France realized that war was now inevitable. Poland was the next country in Hitler's sights, and Britain and France had promised to defend Poland in case of an attack. But they had already lost valuable time, and now the window for diplomatic solutions was closing fast. The final consequences. The path to war. When Hitler invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, the world could no longer ignore the situation. Britain and France declared war on Germany just 2 days later, officially marking the start of World War II. However, the damage had already been done. The failure of appeasement allowed Nazi Germany to grow stronger, and by the time war was declared, Hitler had already gained control of vast territories in Europe. The consequences of appeasement were devastating. By allowing Hitler to take what he wanted without opposition, Britain, France, and other nations had emboldened a dictator who had no intention of stopping. The policy of appeasement had allowed Germany to build its military power and expand its territory, and it had allowed Hitler to create a war machine that would ultimately lead to the deaths of millions of people. Lessons from the failure of appeasement. The failure of appeasement is one of the most important lessons of history. It teaches us that allowing dictators to expand their power without opposition only leads to more aggression. By the time Britain and France declared war, Hitler had already set in motion a global conflict that would reshape the world. The failure to act early in the face of aggression led to World War II, a war that caused unimaginable destruction and loss of life. The lesson from appeasement is clear. When faced with aggression, it is crucial to stand up early and decisively. By doing so, we can avoid the devastation that comes from giving in to tyrants. Appeasement may seem like an easy way to avoid conflict, but in the end, it only prolongs the suffering and increases the likelihood of a larger, more destructive war. Conclusion. The failure of appeasement marked a tragic turning point in world history. By believing that giving Hitler what he wanted would prevent war, the leaders of Britain and France allowed Nazi Germany to grow stronger and more dangerous. The Munich Agreement, hailed as a diplomatic victory at the time, ended up being a monumental mistake. It encouraged Hitler's aggression and paved the way for World War II. The lessons of appeasement remind us that compromise with aggression often leads to disastrous results. When we face threats to peace and freedom, we must act quickly and decisively to prevent the situation from getting worse. The failure to do so in 1938 and 1939 changed the world forever.